January 17, 1945. Somewhere in the dense jungle hills of northern Luzon, Philippines, the monsoon rains had turned the mountain trails into rivers of red mud. Through the mist, a column of exhausted figures stumbled forward. 37 women, their once white uniforms now torn and stained beyond recognition. They moved in silence, flanked by American soldiers whose rifles hung loosely at their sides. The women kept their eyes fixed downward, awaiting the inevitable. They had been taught since childhood what happened to prisoners. They had been told what Americans did to captives. Each footstep toward the camp felt like a march toward oblivion. Among them walked Lieutenant Yamamoto Sachiko, a military nurse who had served 18 months in the field hospitals of the Imperial Japanese Army. Her feet bled through makeshift cloth wrappings. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from the terrible certainty of what awaited. She had seen the propaganda films. She had heard the stories whispered in the medical tents. American soldiers were beasts, devils who tortured and humiliated. Better to die with honor than to suffer such degradation. She had attempted to take her own life twice in the past 3 days. Both times, American soldiers had stopped her, their faces showing something she could not comprehend: concern. The irony was profound and terrible. These women, nurses, communication specialists, administrative personnel, had spent years serving an empire that promised them glory and purpose. Now they faced capture by an enemy they had been conditioned to fear more than death itself. What none of them could have anticipated, what would shake the very foundation of everything they believed, was that the Americans would treat them not as conquered enemies or property, but as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. This simple act of humanity would prove more devastating to imperial ideology than any bomb or bullet. To understand the magnitude of what these women experienced, one must first understand the depth of indoctrination that shaped their worldview. From 1937 onward, Japanese education had been systematically transformed into a tool of militaristic propaganda. Girls as young as 6 attended classes where they learned that the emperor was divine, that the Japanese race was superior to all others, and that Americans were a mongrel people lacking discipline, honor, and moral clarity. In 1941, the Ministry of Education distributed a textbook titled The Way of Subjects to every school in the Japanese Empire. Chapter 7 dealt specifically with enemy nations. American soldiers, it claimed, were cowards who relied on machines because they lacked spiritual strength. American women were morally corrupt, engaging freely in relations outside marriage. American society itself was portrayed as chaotic, individualistic, and weak, a civilization in decay that would crumble before the spiritual purity of Japan. For women entering military service, the indoctrination intensified. Military nurses underwent training that included lectures on enemy conduct. Lieutenant Colonel Nakamura Kenji, who oversaw nurse training in Tokyo from 1942 to 1944, later testified that instructors regularly told female recruits that American soldiers committed unspeakable acts against captured women. "We were taught that surrender meant suffering worse than death," recalled Nurse Tanaka Yuki in a 1952 interview. "They showed us photographs, whether real or fabricated I cannot say, of Chinese women they claimed had been violated by American forces. The message was clear: capture meant horror beyond imagination." This propaganda served multiple purposes. It ensured absolute loyalty, discouraged surrender, and reinforced the belief that only Japan offered women protection and dignity. The irony, of course, was that the Imperial Japanese Army itself had established the brutal comfort women system, forcing tens of thousands of women into sexual slavery. But such contradictions were hidden from those like Lieutenant Yamamoto, who truly believed in the nobility of their cause. Statistical records reveal the effectiveness of this psychological conditioning. Between 1941 and 1945, fewer than 200 Japanese military women were taken prisoner by Allied forces in the entire Pacific theater. The vast majority chose death over capture. On Saipan in July 1944, Japanese civilians and military personnel, including dozens of nurses, threw themselves from cliffs rather than face American occupation. Approximately 1,000 people died at what became known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff. They jumped believing they were escaping a fate worse than death. The 37 women captured in January 1945 had been cut off from their unit during the American advance through the Philippines. Exhausted, starving, and without the means to commit honorable suicide, they were discovered in a cave system by elements of the 32nd Infantry Division. For 3 days, American psychological warfare specialists used loudspeakers to broadcast messages in Japanese, promising fair treatment. The women did not believe it. They emerged only when smoke grenades were deployed, and they faced suffocation. Private First Class Donald Richardson of Cleveland, Ohio, was among the first American soldiers to enter the cave. His account, recorded in a letter to his sister dated January 20, 1945, captures the initial encounter. They were in the back, huddled together like frightened birds. Some were crying. A few held their hands up to their faces as if to ward off blows. One older woman, I learned later she was an officer, stood in front of the others with her arms spread wide, as if she could shield them. Her face was set like stone. She was waiting for us to kill her, I think. Instead, Sergeant Morrison called for the interpreter and asked if any of them needed medical attention. The confusion on their faces, I'll never forget it. The scene Richardson described was repeated across multiple accounts. The women expected violence, humiliation, perhaps immediate execution. What they received instead was water, medical assessment, and transport to a holding facility where female American nurses waited to provide care. This initial encounter set the pattern for everything that followed. Lieutenant Yamamoto later recalled her bewilderment. "The American soldier who gave me water," he smiled. Not a cruel smile, but something almost kind. I did not understand. I had been taught Americans delighted in cruelty. Yet here was gentleness. I thought perhaps it was a trick, a way to make us lower our guard before the real torture began. The women were transported to a prisoner of war facility near Calasiao, Pangasinan. The journey took 6 hours through mountain roads. During the entire trip, not one woman was touched inappropriately. Not one was struck or verbally abused. For women conditioned to expect barbarism, this restraint was incomprehensible. Several later admitted they spent the entire journey in a state of confused terror, waiting for the mask to drop. Upon arrival at the camp, something unprecedented occurred. The women were processed not by male soldiers but by female personnel from the Army Nurse Corps and Women's Army Corps. Captain Eleanor Morrison, the ranking female officer at the facility, had insisted on this arrangement specifically to ease the prisoners' transition. "We understood from intelligence reports how deeply these women feared us," Morrison wrote in her official report. The presence of American women, treated as equals by the male soldiers, would speak louder than any propaganda pamphlet. Morrison's intuition proved correct. The sight of American women in military uniform giving orders to men who obeyed without question, moving freely and confidently through the camp, this image shattered the first layer of propaganda. Japanese women serving the military held positions of auxiliary support. They followed orders from men, deferred to male authority, and occupied spaces defined by traditional gender hierarchies. The autonomy of American military women was a revelation. The prisoner facility at Calasiao had been established 3 weeks prior, specifically to handle the anticipated influx of Japanese prisoners as American forces advanced. It was designed following Geneva Convention standards, though Japan had never ratified the treaty. The compound consisted of 6 bamboo barracks, a medical facility, a mess hall, latrines, and washing facilities. Barbed wire marked the perimeter with guard towers at each corner. By prison standards, it was Spartan but adequate. For the Japanese women, it might as well have been a luxury resort. The first shock came during medical screening. American nurses conducted examinations with professionalism and respect. They asked permission before physical contact. They provided clean gowns. When they discovered the malnutrition and various tropical diseases afflicting nearly every prisoner, they treated conditions with genuine concern. Nurse Patricia Donnelly from Boston later recalled, "One woman," she couldn't have weighed more than 80 pounds, wept when I applied antibiotic ointment to her infected feet. Just wept and wept. I don't think anyone had shown her basic kindness in a very long time. Medical records from the facility document the physical toll of Japanese military service on these women. The average prisoner was malnourished, showing protein deficiency and vitamin depletion. 17 suffered from malaria. 9 had untreated wounds that had become infected. 4 showed signs of tuberculosis. American medical personnel treated every condition with the same standard of care provided to their own wounded. This equality of medical treatment represented a profound ideological statement. In the Japanese military hierarchy, resources were allocated according to rank and perceived value to the war effort. Medical care prioritized combat soldiers. Support personnel received whatever remained. Female auxiliary staff ranked lowest in this hierarchy. Many of the captured nurses had become accustomed to treating their own ailments with whatever materials they could scavenge. Now they found themselves receiving penicillin, a drug so valuable that Japanese forces had almost no access to it. Administered by enemy nurses who saw them not as conquered foes but as patients requiring care. The second shock came at mealtime. The mess hall served food on metal trays divided into sections. The portions were generous, more food than many prisoners had seen in months. There was meat, vegetables, rice, bread, and something utterly foreign: dessert, canned peaches in sweet syrup, or occasionally, chocolate pudding. Private Hasegawa Michiko, age 22, described her first meal in American custody in a diary she kept throughout her imprisonment. "They gave us so much food. I thought perhaps it was a mistake, that they meant this tray for multiple people. But the American woman serving," she gestured that it was mine alone. "I could not finish even half." Around me my companions ate slowly, still fearful that this abundance was temporary, that tomorrow we would receive nothing and this feast would be revealed as cruel mockery. But tomorrow came, and the food came again, just as plentiful. The abundance was not accidental. American military logistics in 1945 represented the most sophisticated supply chain ever created. Even at the end of extended supply lines stretching across the Pacific, American forces maintained access to varied, nutritious food. The daily caloric intake for an American soldier in the Philippines exceeded 4,000 calories. Prisoners of war received approximately 3,000 calories daily, more than most Japanese. Soldiers in active combat units were receiving at the same time. This disparity revealed a fundamental difference in industrial capacity and societal organization. Japan, stretched across a vast empire and cut off from resources by American submarine warfare, was slowly starving. Its soldiers subsisted on rice and whatever they could forage. Its civilians faced increasing hunger as the war continued. Meanwhile, America, protected by oceans and possessing massive agricultural and industrial infrastructure, could feed its military lavishly and still provide generous rations to enemy prisoners. The symbolic power of food cannot be overstated. Every meal became a lesson in American abundance. The prisoners had been told that America was weak, that its people were soft and its economy fragile. Yet here was evidence of productive capacity that dwarfed anything the Japanese Empire could muster. The canned peaches especially became an object of fascination. Fruit preserved in metal, transported thousands of miles, served to prisoners. It represented a kind of luxury that seemed almost wasteful in its generosity. The third, and perhaps most profound shock, came from daily interactions with their captors. The American personnel at Calasiao treated the Japanese prisoners with consistent, even-handed respect. They were addressed politely. Their requests were considered. When conflicts arose, as they inevitably did in any institutional setting, they were resolved through established procedures, not arbitrary violence. Captain Morrison established a daily routine that included work assignments, education opportunities, and recreation time. Prisoners who were medically cleared were assigned light duties: laundry, kitchen assistance, camp maintenance. They were paid a small wage in camp scrip that could be used at the canteen for personal items: soap, writing paper, cigarettes. This compensation for labor was entirely foreign to women accustomed to service, without expectation of reward beyond fulfilling duty. The work assignments revealed another dimension of American equality. Female prisoners worked alongside male prisoners who had been captured in separate operations. In the Japanese military system, men and women occupied strictly separate spheres. Here the Americans made no such distinction. Work was assigned based on physical capability and skill, not gender. Women who demonstrated organizational ability were placed in supervisory roles over work details that included men. This reversal of expected hierarchy caused significant initial discomfort, but also forced a reconsideration of assumed natural orders. Lieutenant Yamamoto found herself assigned to assist in the camp medical facility, working under the supervision of American nurses. Her training made her valuable, and the Americans recognized this immediately. "I expected to scrub floors or clean bedpans," she later wrote. "Instead, they asked me to help with patient care. They watched my technique, asked about my training, and then, incredibly, began treating me as a colleague. They asked my opinion on diagnoses. They listened when I suggested treatments. In the Imperial Army, even male doctors often dismissed my observations. Here, these American nurses treated my knowledge with respect. This professional respect extended beyond the medical facility. Communication specialists were asked to help with translation work. Administrative personnel were utilized to organize camp records. The Americans identified skills and used them, regardless of the gender or national origin of the person possessing those skills. Meritocracy, that fundamental American value, was on display daily. Recreation time provided another window into American values. The prisoners were allowed to organize activities, traditional songs, games, discussions. They were provided with reading materials including newspapers and magazines. These publications, even when they arrived weeks late, opened another channel of revelation. The newspapers were full of civilian news, sports scores, entertainment reviews, political debates. American publications openly discussed setbacks and criticized government decisions. This free press, this open criticism of authority, was shocking to women raised in a society where such dissent meant imprisonment or worse. One magazine in particular made deep impressions. Life magazine with its photographic essays. The February 1945 issue showed American women working in factories, women in military uniform, women voting. The images contradicted everything the prisoners had been taught about American women as frivolous and morally corrupt. Here was evidence of women as active, valued participants in society, contributing to the war effort while maintaining families, pursuing education, exercising political power. Sergeant Nakamura Fumiko, age 28, reflected on this in a conversation with an American nurse, recorded in the camp chaplain's notes. "In Japan, we are told we serve the emperor by supporting men. We are valuable as mothers and supporters. Here I see your women serve as equals. They make decisions, they lead, and your men do not seem diminished by this. I do not understand how this works, but I see that it does work." As weeks passed, the cognitive dissonance deepened. Everything the prisoners had been taught clashed with observed reality. Americans were supposed to be individualistic and selfish, yet they worked together with remarkable coordination. They were supposed to lack spiritual discipline, yet they maintained order and efficiency without harsh punishment. They were supposed to be morally corrupt, yet they treated prisoners with consistent decency. The presence of African American soldiers at the camp added another layer of complexity. Japanese propaganda had specifically targeted race as an American weakness, portraying the nation as divided between white oppressors and degraded minorities. The reality was more complicated. Yes, the American military was segregated. Black soldiers generally served in separate units with white officers. But at Kalasiao, black and white soldiers worked side by side in guard details and administrative roles. They ate in the same mess halls, shared recreational facilities, and appeared to regard each other as comrades. For the Japanese prisoners, this presented a puzzle. Their propaganda had prepared them to see racial hatred and division. Instead, they witnessed what, to their eyes, looked like relative harmony. The reality of American racism with all its complexity and contradiction, was actually less severe than they had been led to believe. One prisoner noted in a recovered diary, "The American Negro soldiers seem well fed and equipped. They carry the same weapons as white soldiers. Some hold ranks of authority. We were told they were treated like animals, but this is clearly untrue. Whatever tensions exist, they are not as propaganda described." This observation, while missing the very real racial injustices that defined American society in 1945, nonetheless captured an important truth. American society, despite its deep flaws, was more integrated and egalitarian than Japanese propaganda allowed. The mere presence of black soldiers in positions of responsibility contradicted the narrative of American racial hierarchy that propaganda had emphasized. Religious services provided yet another revelation. The camp chaplain, Captain James O'Sullivan from Chicago, held weekly services that prisoners were invited but not required to attend. O'Sullivan was Catholic. His assistant was Protestant. A Jewish chaplain visited monthly. The prisoners observed Americans of different faiths working together, respecting each other's practices, and maintaining religious freedom even in a military context. Japan had largely suppressed religious diversity during the war years, promoting state Shinto and suppressing Christian practices. The open religious pluralism of the American military demonstrated another facet of democratic society: the ability to maintain multiple truth claims simultaneously without social collapse. For women raised in a society that demanded absolute ideological conformity, this religious diversity was almost incomprehensible. How could a society function when people believed different things about fundamental questions? Yet here was evidence that it not only functioned, but thrived. The psychological pressure of these contradictions manifested in different ways. Some prisoners withdrew into silence, refusing to engage with the cognitive dissonance. Others became openly curious, asking questions of guards and nurses, seeking to understand this strange American world. A few experienced complete ideological collapse, the foundation of their beliefs crumbling beneath the weight of observed reality. Lieutenant Yamamoto fell into the third category. 6 weeks into her imprisonment, she requested a private meeting with Captain Morrison. The conversation, recorded in Morrison's official log, reveals the depth of Yamamoto's crisis. She told me she no longer knew what to believe. Everything she had been taught was proving false. She said she felt like a child discovering that adults had lied about everything important. She asked me, "How do I know what is true?" I told her she would have to decide that for herself, that we could not give her truth, only offer information and let her draw conclusions. This answer seemed to distress her almost as much as comfort. Morrison's response captured something essential about the democratic mindset. The idea that truth is discovered through individual reasoning, rather than received from authority. For Yamamoto, raised in a culture that emphasized collective harmony and deference to hierarchy, this was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. To be told, "Decide for yourself," was to be given a responsibility she had never been trained to bear. Other prisoners experienced similar crises. Nurse Sato Keiko, age 31, attempted suicide again 3 weeks into captivity. When asked why, she explained through an interpreter that she could not reconcile what she was experiencing with what she believed. "If everything I was taught is lies, then who am I? What have I been serving? My entire life has been in service to ideals that now seem false. I do not know how to exist without those ideals." American medical personnel placed her under observation and worked to provide psychological support, though the tools for addressing ideological trauma were limited at the time. Yet for every prisoner who broke under the cognitive strain, others began to rebuild their understanding. They started asking questions about American history, government, and society. They wanted to understand how a nation of such apparent chaos and individualism could generate such remarkable power and prosperity. The Americans, for their part, attempted to answer honestly, not hiding their society's flaws, but explaining the principles that guided it. Education classes were established in March 1945, initially to teach English but gradually expanding to cover broader topics. American instructors discussed the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the concept of representative government. They explained, as best they could to an audience with no frame of reference, the idea that government derived its power from the consent of the governed, that leaders were chosen through elections, that individual rights were protected from government intrusion. These concepts had no direct parallel in the prisoner's experience. The closest approximation in Japanese thought was perhaps the ancient ideal of benevolent imperial rule, but even that presumed a divine emperor whose authority came from heaven, not from the people. The idea that ordinary citizens could choose and dismiss leaders, that government existed to serve the people rather than the reverse, this was revolutionary in the most literal sense. Throughout this experience, certain objects took on symbolic significance. The canned peaches became an emblem of American abundance, passed around and marveled at. Chocolate bars, distributed occasionally as treats, represented luxury and generosity. But the most powerful symbol was something smaller and more personal: the American military ID tags. The metal rectangles worn by every soldier stamped with name, serial number, blood type, and religious preference. The prisoners were issued their own identification cards with their names, a registration number, and basic information. These cards were not permanent. They would be returned upon eventual repatriation. But while held in American custody, the cards represented something profound: official recognition of individual identity. In the Japanese military system, individuals were subsumed into units, their value measured by their contribution to collective goals. The American system tracked individuals, recorded their personal information, acknowledged them as distinct beings with specific characteristics and needs. Private Hasegawa reflected on this in her diary. "I have a card with my name." The Americans refer to this card when distributing mail or making assignments. "They use my name, not just my unit designation." This seems a small thing, but it is not small. It is recognition that I exist as an individual, not merely as a component of a larger machine. I do not know if I am comfortable with this recognition, but I find I value it nonetheless. The mail Hasegawa mentioned represented another dimension of American individuality. The Red Cross had established procedures for prisoners to send and receive correspondence, though the logistics were complex and unreliable in 1945. Nonetheless, prisoners were given writing paper and encouraged to send letters to family, letters that would be held until war's end but would at least be preserved. American personnel themselves wrote frequent letters home, and prisoners observed this constant flow of personal correspondence. The content of American letters, sometimes glimpsed or overheard during mail distribution, revealed tight family bonds and emotional openness that surprised the prisoners. American soldiers wrote unabashedly of missing their mothers, longing for their wives, worrying about their children. Japanese military culture had discouraged such emotional expression as unbefitting warriors. The Americans seemed to feel no shame in admitting feelings, in expressing vulnerability, in acknowledging the personal cost of separation. April 29, 1945, marked Emperor Hirohito's 44th birthday. In Japan, this day was a major national holiday, celebrated with ceremonies and renewed expressions of loyalty to the throne. At Kalasiao, the Japanese prisoners requested permission to hold a small ceremony acknowledging the day. This request put American administrators in a delicate position: allow the ceremony and risk appearing to endorse enemy ideology, or refuse and betray their stated principles of respecting prisoners' dignity and cultural practices. Captain Morrison approved the request with certain limitations. The prisoners could gather, could conduct traditional songs and prayers, but could not display the Japanese flag or make political statements advocating for Japanese victory. On the morning of April 29th, 37 women gathered in the camp's recreation area and conducted a quiet ceremony. They sang traditional songs, observed a moment of silence, and reflected on their homeland. What happened next was not planned. Several American personnel, hearing the singing, approached and stood respectfully at a distance, observing. They did not interrupt, did not mock, did not display hostility. They simply acknowledged that something meaningful was occurring and gave it space. When the ceremony concluded, Captain Morrison approached Lieutenant Yamamoto and asked if the ceremony had been meaningful. Yamamoto, surprised by the question, confirmed that it had been. Morrison nodded and said, "I'm glad. Even though we are enemies in war, we can respect what is important to each other as humans." This small interaction, respect shown to an enemy's cultural practices, captured something essential about democratic values. The Americans did not require ideological conformity. They did not demand that prisoners renounce their culture or heritage. They recognized a distinction between respecting human dignity and endorsing political ideology. You could disagree profoundly with someone's beliefs while still treating them with basic decency. For the prisoners, this experience was transformative. In a fascist system, there is only one truth, one correct way to live, one acceptable ideology. All else must be suppressed or destroyed. But here were Americans demonstrating that multiple truths could coexist, that one could respect another's values without adopting them, that tolerance was not weakness, but a form of strength. Private Hasegawa wrote, "Today we honored the emperor, and the Americans allowed this. They did not agree with our loyalty, but they did not prevent our expression. I am confused by this. In Japan, we are taught that one must be completely loyal or be destroyed as a traitor. There is no middle ground. The Americans seem to live in middle ground constantly, accepting disagreement without conflict. I do not understand how this is possible, yet I witness it daily." In May 1945, camp administrators installed a radio in the recreation hall, allowing prisoners to listen to music and approved programming during recreation hours. The radio played American Forces Radio Service broadcasts, music, news, comedy shows, dramas. For the prisoners, this provided another window into American culture. The music was a revelation. Jazz, swing, big band, styles that had been banned in wartime Japan as decadent Western influences, now filled the barracks. The rhythms were energetic, improvisational, joyful. Some prisoners found it chaotic and disturbing. Others began to tap their feet unconsciously, responding to the infectious energy. The music embodied American values: individual expression within collective structure, improvisation within rules, freedom within form. The comedy shows were harder to understand. Cultural references and language barriers made much of the humor opaque. But the laughter was unmistakable, the evident joy of the American personnel listening together. Humor, like music, revealed something about national character. The Americans laughed easily, made fun of themselves and their leaders, found joy even in difficult circumstances. News broadcasts provided the most valuable information. By May 1945, Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Allied forces were closing in on the Japanese home islands. American bombers were striking Japanese cities with increasing intensity. The news was grim for Japan, and the prisoners knew it. But the way the news was delivered mattered. The American broadcasters did not gloat over enemy suffering or celebrate civilian deaths. They reported facts, discussed strategy, expressed hope for swift conclusion to the war. When discussing the devastation of Japanese cities, there was no audible pleasure, only a weary acknowledgement of war's brutal necessities. This restraint impressed the prisoners. They had expected triumphalism and mockery. Instead, they heard professionalism and a degree of empathy that surprised them. Lieutenant Yamamoto later reflected, "They were destroying our cities, killing our people, yet when they spoke of it on the radio, there was no hatred in their voices, only determination to end the war. They seemed almost sad about the necessity of such destruction. I had thought Americans would celebrate our suffering. Instead, they seemed to view it as a regrettable but necessary cost of our leaders' refusal to surrender." This distinction between Japanese people and Japanese militarist government was something I had never considered. This distinction would become crucial in the post-war reconstruction of Japan. The American occupation would be built on the premise that the Japanese people had been led astray by militarist leaders, that the population itself was not inherently evil, but had been corrupted by bad governance. This view allowed for reconciliation rather than permanent enmity. The prisoners at Kalasiao were encountering this philosophy in practice, experiencing firsthand the American belief that war was between governments and systems, not between peoples. The news came over the radio on August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice, speaking to his subjects directly for the first time in history, announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. The prisoners gathered around the radio in stunned silence, listening to the tinny, formal language declaring that Japan would bear the unbearable and accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The reaction was complex. Relief that the killing would stop mixed with profound grief and shame. Japan had never lost a war in its history. The concept of national defeat was almost incomprehensible. The divine emperor had acknowledged reality, had chosen survival over continued resistance. What did this mean for everything they had believed? If Japan could lose, if the emperor could surrender, what remained of the ideology that had given their lives meaning? Several prisoners wept openly. Others sat in silent shock. A few seemed almost relieved, as if a terrible weight had been lifted. Lieutenant Yamamoto experienced all these emotions simultaneously. "I felt grief for my country's defeat," she later wrote, "but I also felt liberation. The decision had been made for us. We no longer had to wrestle with impossible loyalties. The war was over, and we had survived. That survival, which would once have been shameful, now seemed precious." The American response to Japanese surrender was instructive. There were celebrations, certainly. Sailors and soldiers rejoicing that they would not have to participate in the planned invasion of Japan. But there was also immediate concern for the massive logistical challenge of occupation and reconstruction. American authorities began making plans for repatriation of prisoners, for treatment of Japanese civilians, for the administration of occupied territories. At Kalasiao, Captain Morrison gathered the prisoners the day after the surrender announcement. Through an interpreter, she explained what would happen next. They would remain at the facility until transport could be arranged for repatriation to Japan. They would be prepared for return to civilian life. They would receive documentation of their treatment in American custody, should they face questions from Japanese authorities. They were no longer enemy prisoners but simply people displaced by war, awaiting return home. Morrison's speech included a passage that struck many prisoners forcefully. "The war between our nations is over. There is no more need for enmity. We hope you will remember that you were treated with respect and dignity, not because you were Japanese, but because you were human beings. We hope you will carry this memory home and use it to help rebuild your country as a place of peace." Democracy cannot be imposed from outside, but perhaps it can be inspired by example. This hope, that the prisoners would become ambassadors of democratic values, was perhaps optimistic. But it reflected a genuine American belief in the power of ideas and the possibility of conversion through experience rather than coercion. The Americans had not tortured or brutalized their prisoners. They had instead demonstrated an alternative way of organizing society, one based on individual dignity and mutual respect. Whether this example would bear fruit in post-war Japan remained to be seen. The process of repatriation took months. Transportation was limited. Priorities had to be established. Documentation had to be completed. The prisoners at Kalasiao remained at the facility until October 1945, when they were finally transported to Manila and then by ship to Yokohama. During those final months, an interesting transformation occurred. The prisoners, no longer fearing immediate death or abuse, became more open in their interactions with American personnel. Conversations became deeper. Questions were asked about American life. What were their homes like? How did their families live? What would they do when they returned home? American soldiers and nurses shared photographs of family, described their hometowns, talked about their hopes for the future. The prisoners reciprocated, discussing life in Japan before the war, describing their own families and communities, acknowledging losses and expressing hopes for reconstruction. These conversations humanized both sides. The Americans learned that their prisoners were not fanatic monsters, but ordinary women who had been caught in circumstances beyond their control. The prisoners learned that Americans were not barbaric devils, but people with families and dreams not so different from their own. War had created artificial enmity between people who, in different circumstances, might have been friends. The canned peaches appeared one final time. As a farewell gesture, American authorities provided each prisoner with a care package for the journey home. The packages included basic necessities, soap, toothpaste, writing paper, but also a few luxury items. Each package contained 1 can of peaches in syrup. This small gesture, this final offering of American abundance, was deeply symbolic. As the prisoners boarded the transport ship, they carried with them these metal cylinders filled with preserved fruit, tangible evidence of what they had experienced. Private Hasegawa's diary entry from the ship captures the moment. "I hold this can of peaches and remember. I remember my fear when we were first captured, my certainty that I would die. I remember the slow realization that I was being treated kindly. I remember the confusion, the questioning, the gradual understanding that everything I had been taught was incomplete at best, lies at worst. This can of peaches is not just food. It is proof that I survived, that I was treated as human, that another way of living is possible. I do not know what awaits in Japan. The country I return to is not the country I left. But I carry this can of peaches, and I carry the memory of American abundance and American respect. These cannot be taken from me." Arriving in Japan in November 1945, the repatriated prisoners faced a devastated homeland. American bombing had destroyed major cities. The economy was shattered. Millions of Japanese were homeless, hungry, and traumatized. The occupation had begun, with American forces implementing sweeping reforms, democratization of government, rights for women, land reform, dissolution of the militarist apparatus. The 37 women who had been prisoners at Kalasiao returned to this chaos. Their reception was mixed. Some families welcomed them with relief and joy. Others viewed them with suspicion. Why had they survived when so many had died? The stigma of surrender, though diminished by the emperor's own capitulation, still carried weight in some quarters. Several of the women chose to remain silent about their experiences, providing only minimal information about their time in American custody. Others spoke more openly, describing the treatment they had received. A few became active participants in post-war reconstruction, working with occupation authorities or joining the nascent women's rights movement that emerged in post-war Japan. Lieutenant Yamamoto fell into the last category. She used her medical training to work in civilian hospitals treating war survivors. She also became involved in efforts to expand rights and opportunities for Japanese women. In a 1948 interview with a Japanese newspaper, she discussed her time as a prisoner. "I learned that women could be treated as equals, that competence mattered more than gender, that dignity was not contingent on submission. These lessons shape my work now. Japan must change. Women must have voice and agency. I saw this was possible. I lived it briefly in an American camp. Now I work to create it here, in my own country." Not all the prisoners drew such progressive conclusions. Some returned to traditional roles, their time in American custody an aberration they preferred not to dwell upon. Others experienced ongoing psychological difficulty, unable to reconcile their wartime indoctrination with their lived experience. Several suffered what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though the terminology and treatment protocols did not yet exist. Nurse Sato Keiko, who had attempted suicide during her captivity, struggled particularly deeply. She returned to her family's home in rural Kyushu, but found herself unable to adjust to civilian life. In 1947, she took her own life. Her surviving letters suggest she never resolved the cognitive dissonance between her beliefs and her experiences, remaining trapped between two irreconcilable worldviews. Her death stands as a reminder that ideological transformation is not always healing, that shattering someone's worldview, even for good reasons, can be psychologically devastating. The immediate post-war period gave way to reconstruction and eventual prosperity. Japan, under American occupation and with substantial American aid, rebuilt its economy and political system. Women gained the right to vote in 1945. The new Constitution, drafted under American supervision, included Article 14 guaranteeing equality under the law regardless of sex. Educational reforms opened opportunities previously unavailable. The transformation was imperfect and incomplete. Traditional gender roles remained powerful, but change was undeniable. The 37 women who had been prisoners at Calasiao lived through this transformation. By the 1970s and 1980s, as historians began investigating prisoner of war experiences more thoroughly, several agreed to be interviewed. Their testimonies provided valuable insight into the psychological dimensions of the Pacific War and the clash between democratic and fascist ideologies. In a 1983 interview, Lieutenant Yamamoto, then 73 years old and retired from a long career in medicine and women's rights advocacy, reflected on her experiences. People ask if my time as an American prisoner changed me. The question misses the point. It did not change me. It revealed to me that I had been living a lie. The Americans did not convert me to their ideology. They simply treated me with basic human decency, and that decency exposed the emptiness of what I had been taught. Everything that followed, my work for women's rights, my advocacy for peace, my rejection of militarism, flowed from that revelation. The Americans showed me through their actions more than their words that another way of living was possible. They treated me as an equal in a time and place where I had no power, no leverage, no claim to respect. They did this not because they had to, but because they believed it was right. That is the essence of democracy. Treating people with dignity not because you are compelled to, but because human dignity is foundational. I spent decades trying to build that foundation in Japan. Private Hasegawa, interviewed in 1979, offered a different perspective. I remember the peaches. That sounds silly, perhaps, but it is true. The peaches symbolized everything. Here was this precious fruit, preserved and transported across the world, given to prisoners. Such waste, such abundance, such casual generosity. In Japan, we had been taught to sacrifice, to do without, to accept hardship as building character. The Americans seemed to believe that abundance was better than scarcity, that comfort was preferable to hardship, that life should be enjoyed rather than merely endured. I do not know if this philosophy is superior, but I know which one I found more pleasant to live under. My time as a prisoner was more comfortable than my time as a free soldier of the emperor. This fact alone demonstrated that something was deeply wrong with our system. Not all testimonies were positive or straightforward. Some former prisoners expressed resentment at having their beliefs challenged, anger at the psychological pressure of ideological conversion, frustration with the pace of change in post-war Japan. The experience of captivity had been complex, mixing relief at survival with shame at defeat, gratitude for decent treatment with grief over national humiliation. These contradictory emotions never fully resolved for some women. What does this story reveal about freedom, abundance, and democracy? At its simplest, it demonstrates the power of example. The Americans at Calasiao did not lecture their prisoners about democracy. They did not force them to read political philosophy or attend indoctrination sessions. Instead, they simply lived according to their values, treating individuals with respect, maintaining rule of law, providing abundance where possible, allowing personal freedom within necessary constraints. This example proved more persuasive than any propaganda. The prisoners experienced firsthand the difference between a society organized around individual dignity and one organized around collective submission to authority. They saw women treated as equals, and men accepting this equality without apparent loss of dignity. They witnessed abundance generated by efficient organization and advanced technology. They observed diverse people working together toward common goals without requiring perfect ideological conformity. The canned peaches, that recurring symbol, embodied these values. The fruit represented abundance, America's superior productive capacity. The preservation and transport represented technological sophistication, America's logistical mastery. The generous distribution to prisoners represented democratic values, the belief that human dignity extends even to enemies. Those small metal cylinders contained, in concentrated form, the essence of American soft power. Yet the story also reveals limitations and contradictions. American society in 1945 was itself deeply flawed. Racial segregation remained legal and enforced. Women, despite gains during wartime, faced systematic discrimination. Economic inequality was substantial. American treatment of Japanese Americans during the war had been shameful, with over 100,000 people imprisoned in camps based solely on ancestry. The contrast between American ideals and American practice was often stark. The prisoners at Calasiao experienced an idealized version of American values: military discipline at its most professional, abundance at its most generous, democracy at its most functional. They did not experience Jim Crow South, urban poverty, or political corruption. They saw America at its best, not its worst. This limited exposure shaped their understanding in ways both helpful and distorted. Nevertheless, even this idealized version of American democracy compared favorably to the reality of Japanese militarism. The gap between American ideals and American practice was narrower than the gap between Japanese propaganda and Japanese reality. America fell short of its principles, but at least possessed principles worth striving toward. Imperial Japan had constructed an ideology that demanded inhumane treatment of both its own citizens and conquered populations. Its practice was faithful to its principles, and those principles were fundamentally corrupt. The last of the 37 prisoners died in 2009 at age 91. With her death, direct memory of the experience passed into history. What remains are documents, official reports, personal diaries, recorded interviews, photographs. These materials tell a story about the power of decency over brutality, of example over coercion, of lived experience over propaganda. The women who survived captivity at Calasiao carried lessons that shaped their lives and, in small ways, shaped post-war Japan. They were not heroes in the conventional sense. They had not performed great deeds or made significant discoveries. But they had experienced something rare and valuable. They had seen their fundamental assumptions proven false and had survived the cognitive restructuring that followed. They had been forced to rebuild their understanding of the world from foundation up, using observed reality rather than received ideology as their building material. This rebuilding was the true victory of American values, not the military defeat of Japan. That was achieved through superior resources and technology, not the occupation and imposed reforms. Those were backed by force and might have bred resentment. But the voluntary recognition by some Japanese women that democratic values, imperfectly practiced but genuinely held, offered a better framework for organizing human society. This recognition could not be forced. It emerged from experience, from the cumulative weight of small decencies, and demonstrated respect. The peaches remained symbolic to the end. In 2003, during a reunion of former prisoners organized by a historical society, someone brought canned peaches as a nostalgic gesture. The elderly women laughed, a sound mixing joy and sorrow, remembrance and disbelief. They had been young once, frightened and certain of death, and then they had been given food in metal cans by soldiers who smiled. That simple act of kindness, repeated daily through months of captivity, had changed them fundamentally. One woman opened the can and distributed the fruit among her former fellow prisoners. They ate slowly, savoring the sweetness, remembering those months when they had first tasted American abundance and American respect. The peaches still tasted of possibility, of a world organized differently than they had been taught to expect, of the strange and unsettling truth that enemies could be kind, and kindness could be more devastating to ideology than any weapon. In a world still shaped by conflict between democratic and authoritarian values, their story remains relevant. It reminds us that the struggle between political systems is ultimately a struggle between competing visions of human dignity. It demonstrates that values are most powerfully communicated through consistent action rather than eloquent speech. And it proves that even small gestures of respect, a meal generously given, a name remembered, a culture honored, can plant seeds that blossom into transformation across decades. The 37. Women who expected death and found instead. Respect carried that experience through the rest of their lives. Some used it to advocate for change. Others simply held it as private knowledge, a secret understanding that the world contained more possibilities than their youth had revealed. All of them, in their own ways, bore witness to a simple truth: that how we treat the powerless reveals who we truly are, and that dignity extended to enemies is more powerful than any propaganda, any weapon, any ideology built on hate. The peaches testified to American abundance, but more importantly, they testified to American choice, the choice to treat prisoners as human beings deserving of respect. That choice, repeated daily through the mundane tasks of running a POW camp, changed lives and, in small ways, changed a nation. It stands as evidence that the most powerful weapon in ideological struggle is not force, but example, not coercion, but consistency, not domination, but simple, persistent, unremarkable human decency. And perhaps that is the final lesson: that freedom's greatest advocate is not the speech or the pamphlet, but the soldier who shares his rations, the nurse who learns a patient's name, the system that treats even its enemies as individuals worthy of dignity. These small acts accumulate into something larger than themselves, into proof that another way of living is possible, that the promises of democracy are not merely propaganda, but principles that can guide action. The women of Calasiao learned this through experience, the most powerful teacher of all. They carried that knowledge home, and though the world they helped create remains imperfect, it is better for their having lived and remembered and, in their own ways, testified to what they witnessed in those months when they were prisoners who were treated as equals.